The morning mist clung to the grounds of Windsor Castle like a shroud, casting everything in an ethereal gray that seemed to match the somber mood that had settled over the royal residence in recent weeks. Sergeant James Mitchell had been walking his usual patrol route for over 15 years, his polished boots creating a rhythmic echo against the ancient stone pathways that had witnessed centuries of royal history. At 42 years old, he had seen his fair share of royal family moments, both joyous and sorrowful, but nothing had quite prepared him for what he was about to discover on this particular Tuesday morning. The sun was just beginning to pierce through the morning clouds when James noticed something unusual near the private gardens that were typically reserved for the immediate royal family. As he approached the secluded area behind the east terrace, where towering oak trees provided natural privacy from prying eyes and camera lenses, he heard what sounded like muffled sobbing. His trained instincts immediately went on high alert, his hand instinctively moving toward his radio, ready to call for backup if needed. However, as he drew closer, carefully moving through the manicured hedgerows that formed a natural barrier around this intimate space, James realized that the source of the distressed sounds was none other than Prince William himself. The future King of England sat alone on an ornate stone bench that had been placed there by Queen Victoria over a century ago, his head buried in his hands, his shoulders shaking with the weight of whatever burden he was carrying. James had encountered Prince William many times during his years of service, always finding him to be composed, dignified, and remarkably approachable for someone of his station. The prince had always acknowledged the guards with genuine warmth, often stopping to ask about their families or to share a brief conversation about the weather or current events. This vulnerability, this raw display of human emotion, was completely foreign to anything James had witnessed before. For a moment, the experienced guard found himself frozen in place, uncertain of the appropriate protocol for such a situation. Should he retreat quietly and pretend he had seen nothing? Should he approach and offer assistance? Should he immediately contact his superiors, or perhaps Princess Catherine? The training manuals had never covered discovering a member of the royal family in such obvious distress, and James felt the weight of responsibility pressing down upon his shoulders. Prince William looked up suddenly, perhaps sensing another presence in his private sanctuary. His eyes were red and swollen, his usually perfectly groomed hair disheveled, and his face bore the unmistakable marks of someone who had been crying for quite some time. When their eyes met, James saw something in the prince's expression that he had never seen before, a mixture of desperation, confusion, and what appeared to be a deep sense of betrayal. "Your Royal Highness," James said softly, immediately bowing his head in respect while maintaining a respectful distance. "I apologize for the intrusion. I was conducting my regular patrol and heard—" He trailed off, unsure how to complete the sentence without potentially embarrassing the prince further. William wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, a gesture so human and vulnerable that it momentarily stripped away all the royal protocols and formalities that usually governed such interactions. "James, isn't it?" he said, his voice hoarse and strained. "You've been guarding us for many years now." 15 years this coming December, James replied, surprised that the prince remembered his name among the dozens of security personnel who rotated through the castle grounds. 15 years, William repeated, almost to himself. "You've seen us grow up, seen us through good times and bad. You were here when George was born, when Charlotte came along, and little Louis, too." There was a wistfulness in his voice, as if he was trying to hold on to memories that suddenly felt precious and fragile. James nodded, remembering those joyous occasions when the castle had been filled with celebration, when staff members had smiled and laughed as they prepared for the arrival of each new royal baby. The contrast to this moment was stark and unsettling. "James," William said suddenly, looking directly at the guard with an intensity that was almost uncomfortable. "What would you do if you discovered that everything you thought you knew about your family, about your life, was built on a lie?" The question hung in the air between them like a challenge, and James felt his heart rate quicken. This was clearly not a casual conversation or a philosophical musing. Something significant had happened, something that had shaken the very foundation of Prince William's world. "I'm not sure I understand, Your Royal Highness," James replied carefully, though his mind was already racing with possibilities. Had there been some sort of scandal? Was the royal marriage in trouble? Had something happened to one of the children? William stood up abruptly, beginning to pace back and forth in front of the bench like a caged animal. His movements were agitated, desperate, completely at odds with the controlled, measured demeanor that had been carefully cultivated since his childhood. "My son," he said finally, the words seeming to tear from his throat. "My beautiful, innocent son has just told me something that changes everything." James felt his stomach drop. Prince George, at 11 years old, was known throughout the castle staff as a bright, curious boy who asked thoughtful questions and showed genuine interest in the history and traditions of his future role. The idea that this child could be the source of such devastating news seemed almost impossible to comprehend. "George came to me this morning," William continued, his voice breaking slightly. He was so excited, so proud of himself for uncovering what he thought was a wonderful family secret. He had been researching our family tree for a school project, you see. His teacher had encouraged all the children to dig deep into their ancestry, to really understand where they came from. The prince stopped pacing and turned to face James directly, his expression a mixture of anguish and disbelief. "He found documents in the royal archives, James, documents that should never have been accessible to him, that should have been locked away forever. But somehow, with his natural curiosity and determination, he managed to uncover them." James felt a chill run down his spine, though he still didn't fully understand what had been discovered. The royal archives contained centuries of documents, many of which contained sensitive information about the family's private affairs, political dealings, and personal relationships. The fact that an 11-year-old had managed to access restricted materials was concerning enough, but the implications of what he might have found were potentially catastrophic. "What did he find, sir?" James asked gently, though part of him wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. William's face crumpled slightly, and for a moment it looked as though he might break down completely again. "Letters," he whispered. "Letters between my father and someone I never knew existed. Letters that reveal a secret that has been hidden from me my entire life. A secret that calls into question everything I thought I knew about who I am, about my place in this family, about my right to the throne itself." The weight of this revelation hit James like a physical blow. As a member of the Royal Protection Team, he had signed numerous confidentiality agreements and had been trained to handle sensitive information with the utmost discretion. But this seemed to go beyond anything he had ever been prepared to deal with. "George was so excited," William continued, tears beginning to flow again. "He thought he had discovered something wonderful, some romantic family secret that would make for a great story in his school presentation. He had no idea that what he had found could potentially destroy everything our family has built, everything we represent to the British people and the Commonwealth." James watched as the prince struggled to maintain his composure, clearly torn between his role as a father who needed to protect his son's innocence and his position as a future monarch who had just learned that his entire life might be built on deception. The guard found himself in the unprecedented position of being the confidant to secrets that could potentially reshape the monarchy itself. "The letters date back over 30 years, William said, sitting back down heavily on the bench as if the weight of his burden was too much to bear while standing. "They reveal a relationship that my father had, a relationship that was kept hidden from everyone, including my mother. But more than that, James, they suggest that I might not be who I think I am." The morning air seemed to grow colder as the full implications of this statement began to sink in. James felt his training kick in, his mind automatically beginning to assess the security implications, the potential for scandal, the need to contain and control information. But at the same time, he couldn't help but feel deeply moved by the human drama unfolding before him. "Your Royal Highness," James said carefully, "have you spoken to anyone else about this? Princess Catherine? His Majesty?" William shook his head, running his hands through his hair in a gesture of pure frustration. "I don't know what to do, James. I don't know who I can trust anymore. If these letters are authentic, if what they suggest is true, then my entire life has been a carefully constructed fiction. My marriage, my children's futures, my role in this country, everything could be at stake." The sound of footsteps on the gravel path caused both men to look up sharply. James immediately stepped forward, positioning himself between the approaching figure and the prince, his protective instincts overwhelming any other considerations. However, as the figure came closer, they both recognized the distinctive silhouette of Princess Catherine. clearly searching for her husband. "William?" Her voice called out, filled with concern and worry. "Darling, where are you?" "George said you seemed upset when you left this morning, and you haven't answered your phone." James looked at Prince William, silently asking for direction on how to handle this delicate situation. The prince's face was a mask of conflicted emotions, love for his wife warring with fear about how she might react to the devastating news he now carried. "I'm here, Catherine!" William called back, his voice carefully controlled despite the emotional turmoil that was clearly raging beneath the surface. "I'm just having a conversation with Sergeant Mitchell about security protocols." As Princess Catherine approached, James could see the immediate concern in her eyes as she took in her husband's obvious distress. Even from a distance, it was clear that he had been crying, and the careful excuse about security protocols wasn't fooling anyone. "William, what's wrong?" she asked directly, her voice filled with the kind of gentle authority that came from years of marriage to someone in the public eye. "You look absolutely dreadful, and George is worried sick that he's done something wrong." The mention of their son seemed to hit Prince William like a physical blow, and James watched as the last of his composure began to crumble. The weight of the secret, the implications for his family, and the impossible position he now found himself in seemed to overwhelm him completely. "Catherine," William said, his voice breaking, "we need to talk, but not here, not where anyone might overhear. James, I may need your help in the coming days. Can I count on your discretion?" "Absolutely, Your Royal Highness," James replied without hesitation. "Whatever you need." As the royal couple walked away together, James remained in the garden for several more minutes, trying to process what he had just witnessed. In 15 years of service, he had never been placed in such a position of trust, had never been made privy to secrets that could potentially shake the very foundations of the British monarchy. The morning sun had fully emerged now, casting long shadows across the garden and highlighting the beauty of the carefully maintained grounds. But for James, the beauty of the morning had been forever changed by the knowledge of the storm that was brewing within the walls of the castle, a storm that had been innocently triggered by a young boy's school project and could potentially change the course of royal history forever. The next 48 hours at Windsor Castle passed in a strange bubble of forced normalcy that felt more suffocating than any crisis James Mitchell had previously witnessed during his years of royal service. Prince William had managed to compose himself enough to carry out his scheduled public appearances, but anyone who knew him well could see the strain etched in the lines around his eyes and the forced nature of his usually genuine smile. James found himself assigned to closer protection duties, assignment that he suspected was not entirely coincidental. Prince William had specifically requested his presence during several private meetings, and James was beginning to understand that his role had evolved far beyond that of a typical security officer. He had become a trusted confidant in what was potentially the most sensitive royal crisis in modern history. On Thursday morning, James was positioned outside the prince's private study when he heard raised voices from within. Through the heavy oak door, he could make out Princess Catherine's voice, strained with emotion, and Prince William's responses, which sounded increasingly desperate and defensive. "You have to tell me exactly what George found," Catherine was saying, her usually calm demeanor clearly stretched to its breaking point. "I've been watching our son for 2 days now, and he knows something is terribly wrong. He keeps asking if he's in trouble, if he did something bad by looking at those papers." William's voice was muffled, but James could hear the anguish in his tone. "I've told you everything I know, Catherine. The letters suggest that my father had a relationship that was kept secret from everyone, including my mother. But the implications are staggering." There was a long pause, and James could hear the sound of papers rustling, presumably the documents that had started this entire ordeal. When Catherine spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper, but the shock was unmistakable. "My God, William. If this is true, if these dates are correct," her voice trailed off and James heard what sounded like a chair being pushed back sharply. "This isn't just about your father's indiscretions. This is about legitimacy, about succession, about everything our children will inherit." The sound of Catherine beginning to pace filled the room, her footsteps quick and agitated. "We need experts to examine these documents immediately. We need to know if they're authentic, if they've been tampered with, if there's any possibility they could be forgeries. designed to destabilize the monarchy. I've already thought of that, William replied, and James could hear the exhaustion in his voice. But who do we trust with something like this? Any expert we bring in becomes another person who knows this secret, another potential leak. And if word of this gets out before we know the truth, the press would have a field day, Catherine finished grimly. The Republicans would seize on it immediately. The very institution of the monarchy could be called into question. James felt his heart racing as he stood guard outside the door. The conversation he was overhearing was confirming his worst fears about the magnitude of what Prince George had inadvertently uncovered. This wasn't just a family secret or personal scandal. This was something that could potentially reshape the entire British constitutional system. Suddenly, the voices stopped, and James heard footsteps approaching the door. He quickly stepped back into his professional stance, maintaining the carefully neutral expression that years of training had ingrained in him. The door opened, and Princess Catherine emerged, her face pale but determined. "Sergeant Mitchell," she said, acknowledging him with a nod that conveyed both recognition of his presence and an understanding that he was now part of whatever crisis they were facing. "My husband would like to speak with you." James entered the study to find Prince William standing by the large window that overlooked the castle grounds. The troublesome documents spread across his mahogany desk like pieces of a puzzle that no one wanted to solve. The prince looked as though he had aged several years in just 2 days, the weight of the secret clearly taking its toll on his physical and emotional well-being. "James," William said without turning around, "I need to ask something of you that goes far beyond your normal duties. I need someone I can trust implicitly, someone who understands the gravity of what we're dealing with, and someone who can help me navigate this situation without compromising the security of my family or the integrity of the crown." "Of course, Your Royal Highness," James replied, though he wasn't entirely sure what was being asked of him. William finally turned to face him, and James was struck by the raw vulnerability in the prince's expression. "I need you to help me get to the bottom of this, but we need to do it quietly, carefully, without alerting anyone who doesn't absolutely need to know. Can you arrange for discreet inquiries to be made? People who can verify the authenticity of these documents without understanding their full significance?" James nodded slowly, his mind already beginning to work through the logistics of such a delicate operation. "I have contacts in document analysis and historical verification who could examine the papers without being told their specific content or significance. We could present them as routine historical research." "Good," William said, some relief evident in his voice. "But there's something else, James. Something even more sensitive." He moved to the desk and picked up one particular letter, holding it as if it might burn him. "This letter isn't just about my father's relationship. It contains specific details about timing, about circumstances that, if true, would mean the prince couldn't seem to finish the sentence, so Catherine, who had been standing quietly by the door, stepped forward. "It would mean that William might not be Charles's biological son," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the earth-shattering nature of her words. The room fell into complete silence as the full weight of this revelation settled over them. James felt as though the ground had shifted beneath his feet. The implications were staggering, not just for Prince William personally, but for the entire line of succession, for Prince George's future, for the very legitimacy of the monarchy itself. The letter describes a relationship that took place during the exact time period when William would have been conceived, Catherine continued, her voice clinical as if discussing medical facts rather than potentially explosive family secrets. And it suggests that this relationship was intimate. James struggled to maintain his professional composure while processing information that could potentially rewrite British history. "Your Royal Highnesses," he said carefully, "if there's even a possibility that this is true, shouldn't His Majesty be informed immediately? How do I approach my father with accusations based on a letter written over 30 years ago? How do I ask the King of England if I'm actually his son? And what if the answer is what I'm beginning to fear it might be?" "But William," Catherine said gently, moving to her husband's side, "you could also discover that these letters are complete fabrications, or that they're being taken out of context, or that there's an perfectly innocent explanation for everything. The only way to know for sure is to investigate properly." Prince William sank into his chair, looking defeated. "And what about George, our brilliant, curious son who uncovered this mess in the first place? How do I explain to an 11-year-old boy that his innocent school project might have uncovered evidence that his grandfather isn't who he thinks he is, and that his father might not have any legitimate claim to the throne? The mention of Prince George brought a new dimension to James's understanding of the crisis. The boy had been so excited about his family history project, so proud of his research skills, so eager to share his discoveries. The idea that his enthusiasm and intelligence had led to such a devastating revelation was heartbreaking. Perhaps, James suggested carefully, we should focus first on verification. Until we know whether these documents are authentic and what they really mean, Prince George doesn't need to know anything other than that his research was excellent and that his findings are being reviewed by adult family members. Catherine nodded gratefully. James is right. We protect George's innocence while we figure out the truth. But William, we can't do this entirely on our own. We're going to need help, and that means bringing in people we trust absolutely. Who? William asked, his voice hollow. Who do we trust with something like this? My private secretary? The palace communications team? My father's advisors? Any one of them could use this information for their own purposes, or it could leak despite their best intentions. James cleared his throat quietly. Your Royal Highness, if I may suggest, there are people within the security services who specialize in sensitive investigations, people who understand both discretion and the national security implications of such matters. They could conduct inquiries without revealing the specific nature of their investigation. William looked up with the first spark of hope James had seen in his eyes since this ordeal began. You think this could be handled as a security matter? Potentially, James replied carefully. If these documents surface through unofficial channels, if there's any possibility they could be used to destabilize the monarchy, then yes, there would be legitimate security concerns that would justify a discreet investigation. Catherine moved to the window, looking out at the grounds where their children often played, where generations of royal children had grown up believing in their destiny and their place in history.
What if the investigation confirms our worst fears?
She asked quietly. What if William really isn't Charles's biological son? The question hung in the air like a sword waiting to fall. James realized that he was not just witnessing a personal family crisis, but potentially a constitutional crisis of unprecedented proportions. The line of succession, the very basis of royal legitimacy, everything that the British monarchy represented could be called into question. Then we deal with that when and if it happens, William said finally, some steel returning to his voice. But until we know for certain, we protect our family, we protect the institution, and we find out the truth as carefully and discreetly as possible. He stood up and moved to James, extending his hand in a gesture that was both formal and deeply personal. James, I'm asking you to help us through this, not just as our security officer, but as someone we trust. Will you help coordinate this investigation? James shook the prince's hand, feeling the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a mantle. Yes, Your Royal Highness, whatever you need. As the afternoon wore on, the three of them began to formulate a plan. James would reach out to his contacts in document analysis and historical verification, presenting the investigation as routine research into royal archives. Catherine would work on maintaining normalcy for the children, while monitoring Prince George for any signs that he suspected the significance of his discovery. William would continue with his public duties while preparing for the possibility that he might need to have the most difficult conversation of his life with his father. But even as they planned and strategized, James could see the toll this secret was taking on the royal couple. The easy affection and partnership that had always characterized their relationship was strained by the weight of what they now carried. Every interaction with their children was colored by the knowledge that those children's futures hung in the balance of what these documents might ultimately reveal. As evening approached and James prepared to leave the study, Prince William called him back. James, he said quietly, thank you for everything you're doing for us, but I need you to understand something. If this investigation proves what I'm beginning to fear it will prove, the consequences will extend far beyond just our family. You're putting yourself at risk by helping us. James met the prince's eyes steadily. Your Royal Highness, I took an oath to protect and serve the crown. That oath doesn't change just because the situation becomes complicated. William nodded gratefully, but James could see that the prince understood they were all venturing into uncharted territory, where traditional oaths and protocols might not be sufficient guides for what lay ahead. Unfortunately, weeks had passed since Prince George's innocent discovery had turned the royal family's world upside down, and James Mitchell found himself in the unprecedented position of coordinating what was essentially a covert investigation into the very heart of the British monarchy. The discreet inquiries he had initiated were beginning to yield results, and unfortunately those results were not providing the reassurance that everyone had desperately hoped for. Dr. Tupu C. Elizabeth Hartwell, a renowned expert in historical document analysis whom James had approached under the guise of routine archival research, had completed her initial examination of the letters. Her findings, delivered in a confidential report that James now carried in a secured briefcase, were both conclusive and devastating. The documents were authentic, dating precisely to the time period indicated, written in the hand of the person they purported to be from, and showed no signs of tampering or forgery. James stood outside Prince William's study once again, but this time the weight of what he carried felt almost unbearable. Inside, he could hear the murmur of voices as the prince and princess prepared to receive news that would either clear their fears or confirm their worst nightmares. He knocked gently and entered when beckoned. Prince William and Princess Catherine sat together on the sofa, their hands clasped tightly, presenting a united front in the face of uncertainty. Both looked as though they had aged years in the past 3 weeks. The stress of maintaining public appearances while privately grappling with such momentous questions having taken a visible toll on their health and spirits. "James," William said, his voice steady but strained, "do you have Dr. Hartwell's findings?" "Yes, Your Royal Highness," James replied, setting the briefcase on the coffee table before them. "I'm afraid the news is complicated." He opened the briefcase and withdrew the sealed report, along with high-resolution photographs of the documents that had been taken during the analysis process. Dr. Hartwell confirms that all of the documents are authentic. The paper, ink, handwriting analysis, and contextual references all support their legitimacy. These letters were indeed written when and by whom they appear to have been written. Catherine's intake of breath was audible, and James saw her grip on William's hand tighten. The prince himself seemed to grow smaller, as if the confirmation of authenticity had physically diminished him. "What exactly do they say?" Catherine asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "We need to know the specific details, no matter how difficult they might be to hear." James opened the report to the relevant section, though he had memorized its contents during his anxious journey to the castle. The letters detail a relationship that lasted approximately 18 months. Beginning 14 months before Your Royal Highness's birth and continuing for several months afterward. The correspondence indicates that this relationship was intimate and ongoing during the crucial time period. William stood up abruptly and moved to the window, his back to the room, his shoulders rigid with tension. "Does it specifically state that I am not my father's biological son?" he asked, his voice carefully controlled. "Not directly, sir," James replied carefully, "but there are references that strongly suggest the possibility. More significantly, there are mentions of concerns about the timing of your birth, about resemblances that others had noted, and about the need for absolute secrecy to protect all parties involved." Catherine had been reading over the report as James spoke, her face growing paler with each page. "William," she said softly, "there's more here. References to other people who were involved in maintaining the secret. Some of these people are still alive." The implications of this revelation hit the room like a physical force. If other people knew about these relationships and had actively participated in concealing them, it meant that Prince William's entire life had been built upon a conspiracy of silence that had lasted for over 4 decades. "Who?" William asked, turning back to face them, his expression a mixture of betrayal and desperate hope. "Who else knew?" James consulted his notes, dreading having to deliver names that would further complicate an already impossible situation. "According to the correspondence, your grandmother's private secretary at the time was aware and helped facilitate the secrecy. There's also mention of a doctor who attended the birth and had concerns about certain timing issues." "My grandmother knew?" William's voice cracked with emotion. "The Queen Mother knew about this and never said anything? She watched me grow up, watched me prepare for my role as future king, and she knew there was a possibility that I had no legitimate right to any of it." Catherine stood and moved to her husband, placing her hands on his shoulders in a gesture of comfort and support. We don't know exactly what she knew or what her motivations were for keeping silent. Maybe she believed you were Charles's son despite the affair. Maybe she was protecting you. Maybe she was protecting the institution of the monarchy itself. James cleared his throat gently, drawing their attention back to his report. There's one more thing, Your Royal Highnesses. Dr. Hartwell found reference in the final letter to an item that was preserved, something that could potentially provide definitive answers to the questions about paternity. Both royals turned to stare at James intently. What kind of item? William asked. Personal effects that would contain biological material suitable for modern DNA analysis. James replied carefully. The letter suggests that someone involved in this situation had the foresight to preserve evidence that could someday resolve any questions about paternity. The room fell into stunned silence as the implications of this discovery sank in. For 40 years, the question of Prince William's true parentage had been a matter of speculation, based on dates and circumstances. Now, suddenly, there was the possibility of definitive scientific proof one way or another. Where? Catherine asked pragmatically. Where would such evidence be kept? James consulted his notes again, though this information was burned into his memory. The letter indicates that the items were placed in a secured location known only to the Queen Mother's private secretary, with instructions that they should only be accessed in the event of a constitutional crisis or direct challenge to the line of succession. And this private secretary? William asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. Died 12 years ago, James confirmed. However, Dr. Hartwell believes that the location might be determinable through other records, potentially within the royal archives themselves or in the private papers that were transferred after his death. Prince William began pacing again, his movements agitated and desperate. So we could actually know the truth, definitively, scientifically. No more speculation. No more living with uncertainty. Yes, James said simply. But Your Royal Highness, once that particular door is opened, there's no closing it again. If the results confirm your legitimacy, then the crisis ends, though the knowledge of your father's affair would still be devastating personally. But if the results indicate otherwise, then my entire life has been a lie, William finished grimly. My children's inheritance, their futures, their identities, everything would be called into question. And beyond that, the constitutional implications would be staggering. Catherine had been listening to this exchange with growing anxiety, but now she spoke up with characteristic directness. But wouldn't it be worse to live with this uncertainty forever? To always wonder, to always carry this secret, to never know whether George and Charlotte and Louis are preparing for roles they may never be able to fulfill? The mention of their children seemed to galvanize something in Prince William. He stopped pacing and looked directly at James with a newfound determination. Can you locate this evidence? Can you find it without alerting anyone else to what we're looking for? James nodded slowly. I believe so, sir. The royal archives are extensive, but with the proper credentials and a careful search methodology, it should be possible to locate the relevant materials. However, this would represent a point of no return. Once we have the evidence, the temptation to seek definitive answers might be overwhelming. What are you saying, James? Catherine asked. I'm saying that pursuing this course of action would likely lead inevitably to DNA testing, and DNA testing would provide answers that might be impossible to live with or to keep secret. The truth, whatever it is, would become a burden that your Royal Highnesses would carry for the rest of your lives. William moved to his desk and sat down heavily, his head in his hands. What choice do I have, really? George found these letters by accident, but what if someone else stumbles across them? What if there are other copies hidden somewhere? What if someone with malicious intent discovers this information and uses it to attack the monarchy? You're right, Catherine said quietly. We can't simply ignore this and hope it goes away. The knowledge exists now, and it will always be there, hanging over everything we do, every decision we make about the children's futures, every public appearance, every constitutional duty. James watched as the royal couple grappled with an impossible decision, understanding that whatever choice they made would have profound consequences not just for their family, but for the entire nation. The weight of constitutional responsibility was something they had been trained for since birth, but nothing could have prepared them for a situation where their personal family crisis and their public duty were so inextricably intertwined. "There's one more consideration," James said reluctantly, knowing he had to present all aspects of the situation. "Prince George. He's been asking questions about his research project, wondering why the adults have been so interested in his family tree work. Eventually, he's going to understand that his discovery was more significant than a simple school assignment." William looked up at this reminder of his son's involvement. How do we explain this to him? How do we tell a brilliant 11-year-old boy that his curiosity and academic excellence might have uncovered evidence that his entire future is built on uncertain ground? "Maybe," Catherine suggested gently, "we don't have to tell him everything until we know everything. If we pursue the DNA testing and the results confirm your legitimacy, then George never needs to know how close we came to a crisis. If the results are different, then we face that challenge when we come to it, as a family." The afternoon sun was beginning to set outside the study windows, casting long shadows across the room where three people sat contemplating a decision that could reshape British history. James found himself in the surreal position of being not just a witness to this historic moment, but an active participant in determining how it would unfold. "James," Prince William said finally, his voice steady with resolve, "I need you to find that evidence. I need to know the truth, whatever it might be. Because living with this uncertainty is slowly destroying everything I thought I understood about my life and my duty." As James nodded his acceptance of this monumental task, he realized that the next phase of this crisis would likely be even more challenging than what they had already endured. The search for physical evidence would require careful coordination, absolute discretion, and nerves of steel from everyone involved. Most importantly, it would lead inevitably to the moment when scientific truth would either validate or destroy everything that Prince William had spent his entire life believing about himself, and his rightful place in the long line of British monarchs. The game, as they say, was afoot, and the stakes could not possibly be higher.